Let's get spooky. This is our Station Boo, where we explore the dark and mysterious corners of the world of horror, and we know that you are dying to listen. All right, and welcome to another spooky and kooky podcast of Earth Station Boo, where we talk all things horror. Introducing our lovely haunted host, we have Lisa.
Hello.
We have Karen.
What's up?
And I'm Shannon. So this episode, we're kind of excited about it. We're going to be discussing what is horror. That always seems to be a great debate on what is considered horror and what is not considered horror. So before we even really dive in on this topic, I'm just going to read a couple of definitions that I stole from the internet, just so that way we know what like the internet, and I did use quotations, says horror is. First, from the Dictionary of Film Studies, defines horror, representing disturbing and dark subject matter, seeking to elicit response of fear, terror, disgust, shock, suspense, and of course, horror from their viewers. The No Film School says horror is a genre of film and television whose purpose is to create feelings of fear, dread, disgust, and horror in its audience. The primary goal is to develop an atmosphere that puts the audience on edge and scares them. And last and not least, Merriam-Webster's dictionary, because you can't go wrong with that one. Horror, a noun. Painful and intense fear, dread, or dismay, intense aversion or repugnance, the quality of inspiring horror, repulsive, horrible, or dismal quality or character, something that inspires horror. And horror as an adjective, collected to inspire feelings of dread or horror. I do think it's interesting that all of those definitions use that word horror to
describe horror. I saw her. I was like, wow, they're using horror to describe horror. That's great.
But at the same time, I feel like all of us understand what that means.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's go ahead and get started. What do we think horror is?
I mean, horror for me is anything and everything that can provoke those feelings of fear and dread. I mean, for some people, beauty can be horrific. And for others, ugliness can be horrific. So depending on how you spin it, as long as it provokes those emotions, it's horror.
Yeah.
And horror for me is, you just get the feeling of dread as well as, foreboding. I think they forgot to put the foreboding because it's like unknown and you're not really ready to accept it. And like he said, yes, beauty can be horrific, especially if you see what people do to make themselves beautiful, or ugliness because someone's never seen that. And it is supposed to elicit some kind of response, which is fear, and which is healthy actually. But horror to me is like a combination of all of that put together and how people react to it.
Yeah. I mean, to me, horror is very much based on somebody's perception, because what I find to be, horrific or fearful or something that puts me on edge is not going to be the same thing for either of you. It's not going to be the same thing for, my brother. It's not going to be the same thing for, Jim Bob Tiddlywinks. It doesn't matter. It matters who you are and your life experiences and what then elicits that emotion and that instinctual response, essentially. It's why I think there are so many almost blurred lines when it comes to horror, where it's like, is this horror or is this not horror? Like, I think this is horror, but then somebody's like, no, that's not horror. Like there's this argument, and it's the reason why we're doing this episode, because it is so nuanced. It is something that is very much based off of somebody's own perspective. and how they interpret the material that they're consuming.
And
Uh,
horror also tends to lend itself to, a lot of other genres, and it fits in perfectly.
mhm,
Because you could have comedic horror or romantic horror or
mhm,
fantasy horror.
yeah,
But like you said, it's the perception of the person and that makes it the blurred lines of, is this horror? Is this not horror?
yeah.
Exactly. Definitely how you perceive it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it really is on depending on how you perceive it. But what do we think needs to be in any form of media that it considers itself horror? So books, shows, movies, theater, podcasts, whatever. What what type of for the media, what do we think needs to actually be in there for it to be considered part of the horror genre specifically? I know that was a heavy.
Yeah.
It's a feeling of foreboding because you know it's coming, but you
Hmm.
don't know when it's coming. You're always
Yeah.
on that edge. Um, Edgar Allan Poe is that author that provokes the foreboding um, that I see a lot, and that always puts me on edge. Like, is that person gonna tell on himself, or is he just gonna keep himself quiet? But what about that heart that keeps beating? Is it gonna drive him crazy? What's going on? Um, as long as for me as it's the foreboding nature of the story, it makes it horror for me.
Okay.
I actually think a little bit more mystery in a sense to help with the foreboding, like what secrets are hidden of something. And the imagination can make up all these stuff that's horrifying. And that helps with the foreboding. Like, and as Karen said in the example of Edgar Allan Poe, there was the foreboding of the old man that he had buried underneath the planks, and he kept hearing the heartbeat, and he was so worried that someone was going to discover it that he gave himself up. But it's like, yeah, you need something mysterious, I think, a little bit more, not so much blatant, but that's just my opinion. I mean, I kind of like the whole building up to the foreboding and, atmosphere and what's really going on and, just kind of a little bit of mysterious effect type of thing.
I mean, to build off of that, early horror films before like the codification of it in the 30s, they were technically under the mystery genre. They were
Yeah.
part of like the detective series and mystery series and things like that. So I think there is that aspect of mystery that does need to be there. I think it's a combination of a lot of things though.
I mean, even in
There is that foreboding. Like there does need to be that like ominous thing that's coming towards you while you're watching this. That's coming for your like essence or whatever it happens to be. But I think it also is mood setting. Like there's usually a very specific look to a film or a show. There's when it comes to music, there's a very specific tone that's used. There's a reason why a lot of times when you think of villains or spooky things, it's in a minor key. It doesn't sound right. It sets you off balance. It puts you in that state of knowing something is coming. And I think that's kind of cool how even things that might not be considered horror by other people, they still set that where you know something is coming, but you don't know what it is.
I mean, it's kind of like in literature, they couldn't really define certain authors as horror. And they end up being in other genres like mystery or fantasy or romance.
Mhm.
Because they couldn't really define what horror was. Like I went to the bookstore the other day and VC Andrews is in the horror section. I was like, I never thought of her as being horror. I thought of her as just being straight fiction, but it's considered horror now.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I think it really does depend also like on the undertones of it. Like, is it something that has like a spooky kind of like undertone or dark gothic kind of like undertone to the storytelling? I know that there's some authors that I enjoy that when I'm like, well, I probably like them because they always kind of have like this like dark. like undertone to the narrative. And I'm like, that might be why I consider it to be horror, or at least horror adjacent, compared to like other things that are a little bit more bright, happy, and sunshine.
Also, yeah, as you're talking about setting the mood in films and stuff, uh, Del Toro, Guillermo del Toro is brilliant at this.
Yeah,
And I
he
was
is.
Oh yeah, I love his works.
the way he uses his lighting to get
Mm.
you comfort the warm yellows, and then all of a sudden you're into the teal blues, and you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then he'll just get you all comfortable, and then he'll start easing you into it, because you'll like see like a scene in one of his movies, the girl sleeping in the bed and it's warm and yellow, and then the door opens and you see the blue in the hallway, and you're like, oh yeah, you get all uncomfortable. And to me, that's really brilliant because it sets the mood and everything. And yeah, I could see why they would put the V.C. Andrews in horror. I've read most of her books, and it is kind of psychologically horrifying. I mean, keeping the kids in the attics and keeping them a secret, and you never know what's going to happen. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I definitely could see why it'd be kind of more like a gothic horror.
Oh yeah.
The other ones are kind of like, they're horrifying, but they're not. I don't know.
I mean, how many movies though start with somebody being locked in an attic?
Well, or
I
locked in
feel
a
like it's
basement
almost
or
like
something.
I feel like it's almost like a necessary like horror trope of,
Locked
oh,
in the basement.
somebody's locked in an attic or a basement.
And also, like when it comes to media, like film, yeah, you have that lighting, but also for me, it's the camera work.
Mm-hmm.
Asian horror has really good camera work when it comes to horror.
Yes.
And when they do remakes of Asian horror, the camera work does not work to make it horrific for me. For me, it has to be the camera work also.
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned like the whole blurred lines kind of thing, and horror adjacent. How do we think perspective helps with that? Helps with blurring the lines and making things adjacent, to other genres and horror. Hmm?
I mean, the blurring the lines, like somebody, I forget an author, me and him were talking. He was like, yeah, it's perspective. Like, say if you have a monster kissing a woman, that is both horrific and romantic. But if the monster's eating the woman's face, that is straight horror. Um, you just have to look at how it makes you feel. A monster kissing a woman and, they become lovers. Okay, that's horrific and yet romance at the same time. Um, some people just think it's straight horror because, like, what woman will fall in love with a monster?
Well, they
Um, there's a lot of movies that where a woman falls in love with a monster, then it's more romance than it is horror. Some people
Beauty
think
and the
it's horrific.
Beast.
yeah,
Yeah, right. I
right.
mean, and then he turns into this like man, and you're like, hmm, you're a cute
Or
Why
man.
are all of us so let down by Adam? Why are we all so let down by him?
Because when you see the beast, he's this big, muscular man, monster, and then when he turns human, you're like, oh,
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't
mm,
know. Yeah, I agree with it. Yeah, like I guess because the beast is transforming into a caring creature instead of trying to terrify everybody. And then he goes back to human, and it's just like, oh, well, is he actually going to learn his lesson because he's back to his beautiful self?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
sad about that because, some patterns repeat themselves.
that's
Mm-hmm.
that's true.
This is true.
But like, this perspective of how you make the story and how you tell the story kind of blurs that line because then it becomes like, is it mystery or is it horror? Is it fantasy or is it horror?
Mm-hmm.
Just that the undertones of what you're using.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about shows like Supernatural or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, things like that. There there are some people who will debate whether or not they're horror because they're like, well, they're not they're not grotesque, they're not gruesome. But at the same time, you're like, it's got vampires and werewolves and like all these supernatural things, and you got slayers, and there's a lot of murder going on too. Like, it has to be horror. But
Okay,
then you'll
like
have people who
Supernatural.
debate that.
Supernatural is horror because of the fact that when they first started off, they're hunting mythological creatures, legends, urban legends. And then
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm going to do this hot take real quick.
Do it.
Supernatural should have ended at like season 5.
I agree.
It should have
Because
definitely ended sooner rather than later. But I think season 5 was still a little too early for it to end. I think they could have done a few more things.
I mean, once they started getting to the whole aspect of angels and demons, oh my God, you're a demon and yada yada yada, it started losing that whole horror aspect for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was no longer horror. In the beginning of the earlier seasons, yes, because who didn't who I mean, as a kid, who never said, Bloody Mary in the mirror?
Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
We all
exactly.
have.
We all have.
Um, and
I did Candyman too.
yeah, and the stories that our parents tell about don't go out in the woods because somebody's going to take you. So
I
yeah,
grew up in the 80s. That's all it was. Stranger danger.
Yeah, danger, danger.
we all grew up
Watch
in
out.
the 80s, so
Yeah,
it's like listening to the stories of the of our elders, or of the Wendigo, of the Yeti and the Sasquatch and all that. That's horror.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it because they elicit that fear. That's what
Yeah.
Supernatural did for me in the earlier seasons.
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'm just saying that there's other people who try to discredit like a lot of stuff that would be considered horror, but because it's on television or because it's not rated R or because it's not super grotesque, they're like, well, is it really horror because it's not that bad? And it's like, well, just because you don't think it is doesn't mean that not everybody else does.
I mean, it doesn't have to be as bloody as, or grotesque as Cannibal Holocaust.
Yeah.
People thought it
Definitely.
was, a snuff film, but it was
Mm-hmm.
more of a horror film than anything. Um, yeah, I remember that. Like, my parents wouldn't let me watch it, and yet my mom was like, "Come here, come here, we're gonna watch it." My dad's like, "No, she's 4," and here's come my mom. We're gonna watch this movie. That was horrific for me at 4 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely not age appropriate. I mean, there's a lot of like some people will say Shaun of the Dead isn't considered horror,
It's a
but
comedic horror.
it's definitely a horror comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a horror comedy. But the people who will say it is because they're like, but I don't get scared when I watch it. And I'm sitting here going, but it still hits all of the horror type
Right,
necessity. It has a weird monster. You got to try to save yourself and your friends and family. There's
right.
undercurrents that are
I mean, yeah,
definitely
like,
horror, but it can still be
okay,
There's,
funny on top of that.
yeah, because you have the fear of, oh my God, these zombies are going to eat me and my friends. We have to get someplace safe. Then there's that terror of, I need to save my mom. Oh my God. And then there's that whole scene with him and his stepdad, and that he's like, Mom, he's not your husband. He's a zombie. And then he turns off the radio. So you have that whole,
that spot is priceless.
because you have that whole terror. It's like, yeah, you have that dread. She's like, she's gonna go back for him because she loves him, and that's her husband. And then
He's
she's
not
gonna
Philip anymore.
more, and then click. Now that horror and dread is like gone. You're like,
Mhm.
yeah,
so yeah, I can understand why they wouldn't see Shaun of the Dead as horror, but it is a comedy horror. It's a horror comedy
Mhm.
because it does hit all of that list. You have that fear of becoming a zombie and running for your life. You have that terror of, oh my God, my friends and family, I need to save them. But then there's little jabs. Oh, you got red on you.
Mhm.
well, there's also Ghostbusters, okay,
Mhm.
and you think about it, when it came out in the 80s, I got to see the movie theaters. Yay, I'm old. But, you think about it, this ancient Sumerian thing that was way before anything else is coming to destroy the world, and there's ghosts all over possessing people and everything. That's kinda scary.
Mhm.
But then the comedy, which is kind of funny. So, but you think about it, you still gotta survive, you still gotta save your friends, you gotta get your friends to unpossessed from being the key master and the gatekeeper.
Mhm.
And then we have the second one, which is a haunted painting of Vigo,
Mhm.
and have a lake of slime. And then, of course, they say, how they say today with the Statue of Liberty. But and you still have that kind of sense like, oh my God, when he's like walking down the halls and you see his eyes start glowing. In the second one, that was like, you know, the recent one, Afterlife, which I love, was really good too. And I can't wait to see the new one coming up soon, but it still kept the flavor. It may have been comedic, but it was still kind of like, hey, what if we did accidentally like bring these ancient Sumerian or ancient, I mean, and some of it's based on science like Tesla and stuff like that. And you're like, did that actually happen?
Mhm.
Kind of funny, but it's kind of dreadful too at the same time.
Any pictures with eyes that seem to follow me, that elicits, like, dread. Like, every time I go to the museum, I'm like, "Their eyes are following me." I very rarely go to the museum with, like, portraits because of that.
It's an actual technique that they did on purpose back in the day.
And I think something that could be almost kinda like a good maybe rule of thought when you're trying to, like, decipher whether or not something could be horror, but you're kinda confused because there's, like, this other element to it. If you take that element out, would it still be considered horror? And so, like, Shaun of the Dead, you take the comedy aspect out of it, it's just another zombie film.
Yeah.
With Ghostbusters, you take the comedy out of it, and it's still a poltergeist film. So it's one of these deals of like, if you take out this other thing that doesn't make it horror, would it be a horror film? And I think 9 times out of 10, yeah. Yeah, that would be the case. I know like Jaws has had that discussion where they're like, "Oh, Jaws isn't a horror film. It's just a big shark." Well, when it got released as a horror film. You know, what about it doesn't make it horror? You know, there's a reason why a lot of people don't go out in the water. And it's because of movies like that
Hmm.
where they're like, "No, the shark is gonna eat me." You know?
Yeah, there's a reason to this day I don't go to a certain point in the ocean. I'm like, no, a great white can come up to this point. I want to stay right here because of Jaws. I mean, it elicits that fear, that terror. People are like, "Oh no, it's a thriller, it's an action film
Yeah.
almost," and I'm like, no, it's horror because it elicits that fear in me.
And see, that's the thing is there's a lot of people who take, like, thrillers or take horror movies, but they're like, "No, it's a thriller, it's not a horror film." And I'm sitting here going, what tips it either way? But what's the tipping point? What do we think that tipping point is between like, a thriller and a horror film?
Or for any films, it's really the tipping point is if you take all the aspects of horror out of it, it's going to be whatever genre you're putting it in. It's going to be straight
Right.
mystery, straight fantasy, straight romance. But if
Yeah.
you put a lot of the aspects of horror back into it and you take out the other, parts of, love and hate and drama, it's going to be straight horror. It's it's the provoking of that of those emotions
Mhm.
of horror and of other genres. Uh, with romance, it's the love part. With mystery, it's the whole aspects of trying to solve that puzzle. But if you take any of the aspects out that makes it what it is, it's going to tip it to either way.
Right.
Yeah, I can agree with that. What is a movie or a show, or maybe even a book that you would say, like, you personally would categorize as horror, but like, the world does not categorize it as horror? I'll go first.
Okay.
I will say there's a movie, called Red Eye with Rachel McAdams and the newly Oscar-winning, uh, Cecilia Murphy or Cillian Murphy, I'm sorry. Um, and I think that is on the horror spectrum because I think it is horrific that she had to go through this ordeal where he had a hitman on her father and he had her pinned in this airplane and she couldn't get away from him. And he threatened to kill her and all the craziness that happened. And how many times did he try to kill her? She was the final girl. in that movie. I would put it in the horror spectrum. Now, very barely in the horror spectrum, but I would put it in there because I think for a lot of us, especially female presenting individuals, that is absolutely scary. That is absolutely terrifying because that's something that we could easily encounter in like everyday life. But I would put that movie in there. Although I think technically it's considered a thriller slash action film.
For me, it's that movie Rubber.
Oh,
It's a horror comedy about a tire that comes to life and kills people. It has more aspects of comedy, but it's billed as horror comedy because you have this tire killing people. And I'm like, when I watch it, I'm not getting those feelings of fear, dread, foreboding. I'm just laughing because this is tire that's an inanimate object that comes to life and kills people. For me, that's that whole. There's a little bit of horror in it, but not really.
Okay.
That's my movie that kind of blurs that line, but more so it tips over more to the whole comedy part.
I would have to say mine is Fahrenheit 451 because you think about it.
Mhm.
Uh, it's horrifying that we have to burn the book and we start banning certain things, and the people get all zealous about it, and they have specific fire people who have to burn them and everything. And just thinking about how that's horrifying because it's like, mind control type of thing,
Mhm.
trying to keep everybody in their place, class, etc. Don't think for yourself. But then again, it's kind of like science fiction too.
Mhm. I mean,
So,
it's like Orwell's book as well.
yeah, it's like it's kind of sort of coming to fruition. Just scary. And then you're like, well, no, they wouldn't actually organize it, but hey, that's kind of terrifying to think about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's also supposed to be a science fiction, but it's got enough of psychological stuff in it that it's horrifying to think that that could actually happen.
So could we say that psychological horror is slightly more broad than what people like necessarily categorize things in?
Oh, definitely.
I would have to agree to that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's just like technically a subgenre for horror, but
I mean, a good instance of psychological horror for me will be the first Saw movie,
Mhm.
because of the fact that he's torturing this poor man because of the bad deeds that he views in his part that he did. Um, and he's also psychologically, torturing other people into his game. So for me, that is a good psychological horror for me. Is this first Saw movie? After that, I don't know. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of hits more into like the shock exploitation, gore aspect versus like the actual psychological portion of it. Um, but I mean, like think about like Psycho and
Oh,
you know, all that kind of stuff. That all sits more on like the psychological portion because you don't know which way's up. And I think a really good horror film will always have a psychological pull for you.
Absolutely.
It will
mm-hmm,
always have
mm-hmm.
that like you didn't see this coming and now you have to like rethink everything in your life.
Right. One of my favorite psychological horrors I would consider is called The Box, Cameron
Mhm.
Diaz, because they choose, do they want to get what they want, or do they want to save because there's choices. You ask for $1 million, you never know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
It's
Who's going to start? So they're like, you're seeing the human, like, do I want to? But,
Mhm.
it's kind of cool because it's like horrifying to think that they could actually turn and go, oh, I don't care about Aunt Martha, push the button, or, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a real mind mess.
it's kind of like it reminds me of a movie called The Circle, where you have like a number of individuals in a circle, in these little light circles, or in a circle as well, and they have to decide who lives, who dies, um, just by certain choices. And the final person, it has to be like a majority vote. Um, and the final person who lives get to live. It's kind of like that whole do I want to save the disabled man or do I want to save myself? Do I want to save the pregnant woman or do I want to save myself?
Mhm.
And you don't know which way the vote's going to go, and it kind of terrifies you psychologically. It's very terrifying because you have to sit there and choose who's going to die or who's going to live.
Yeah.
Y'all should watch it. It's a good movie.
It's good.
It is a good one.
Would You Ever's kind of sort of like that one too, where everybody goes to this rich person's house to play a game and see who wins, and they have to choose: would you shock this guy or would you shock yourself?
Mhm.
And it gets really messed up. It's got the guy from Reanimator in it, so
Okay.
he's just a great actor.
Yeah,
But it's
that was a good movie.
it's on Tubi.
Yeah. So kind of going back to one of the earlier questions, like what needs to be in it in order for it to be considered horror? Like what are elements that you like in the storytelling for you to like feel like it's more like a horror film? Like I personally like it when there is more of like, you know, the supernatural and the killing and the psychological stuff. Like I like when there's like a lot of that kind of like dark, morbid type of storytelling where there's these aspects where you're just like, that's not going to happen in everyday life.
Um, for me, is if it could put me in the mindset of the victim, like the choices I can make, the choices,
Hmm.
I don't want to, get hurt in this situation. I don't want to die in this situation. So for me, if I could put myself, if the story could put me in the story, like, if I could see myself as the character,
So kind of like Cabin in the
then
Woods.
yeah,
Yeah, that was good.
yeah, then that makes a good horror movie for me.
I definitely have to agree with Karen on the characters. You want to either root for the characters, feel what they're feeling. You want to feel that, so you're like literally in the story. I think if you have really bad written characters, you don't care either way. You want to either root for them or say, "Oh, girl, you're going to run in those heels. You might as well just die." You want that participation. I think better character development, and I personally like monsters and mysteries and like urban legend type of cryptozoology kind of weirdness
Okay.
more than gore.
My mom can run in heels. She's proven that she can run in heels. And even in dangerous situations, she will run in heels.
Yeah,
Even if she becomes the final girl, she will run in heels.
hey, more power to anybody who can. I cannot. But then again, I'm like the girl who's 99% of the time barefoot. So
Well, then your feet are tough for the ground if there's glass and stuff.
Yep.
I could see you being a final girl running through the woods with bare feet.
I've done it. Well, not as a final girl, but I have definitely gone running barefoot in the woods. So what are some like specific like storytelling things that they do visually that you guys think are like quintessential horror? Personally for me, I love it. It's when there's very limited lighting where it's like you can see their shadows moving in the background, but at the same time you have no idea what's back there. And like the way that they shoot it where you can just see the victim's face. Like I kind of like that kind of thing where it's just the right camera angles and the right lighting.
For me, it's the practical effects that puts me into that whole groove of horror. I've seen some really bad CGI effects in horror movies. For me, it has to be the practical effects, like the blood spatter,
Mhm.
the weapon going to the person, the wounds, and the monsters. Um, I was watching a movie the other day, and someone was shooting at somebody, and you could see the CGI blood going everywhere. And I was like, "Oh, this is gonna be a horror
Yeah,
movie."
I can definitely agree with you with that. I like lighting, and I agree, but there is a difference between bad lighting where it's so dark you can't even see the shadows,
Mhm.
and lighting like like I was talking about Del Toro and the Boogeyman that came out, the Stephen King. That one scene where they're doing the hypnotism thing with the red lighting was just, it had me on my seat. It was, but yeah, practical effects is a big thing for me. I mean, there's some really bad practical effects out there,
Oh
Oh
yeah.
but
yeah.
there's some good ones. Yeah,
But that's
yeah.
why we love the
It's like,
B-rated, gimmicky horror movies.
but lighting combined with the, I like kind of like where they just hint to you at the monster a little bit or whatever. Just atmosphere gives you such a sense.
Yeah.
I don't rush into it or find out it's a Muppet like in that one movie at the end of the movie instead of like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just good for them all around. That makes it better.
So how would we rate on like the scale of like, oh yeah, this is absolute horror, or this kind of sits more in like the blurred lines of horror? How would we rate like the original like Addams Family TV show and like the Munsters? Because even though they're like spooky, kooky, even though yes, they're like vampires and Frankenstein and like all that kind of stuff, it was still kind of like wholesome television. So where would you guys put that?
I mean, I put it at the far spectrum of it was not horror and it was not between. It was more of the further past the blurred. It was more of the comedy, not the horror comedy. It was just straight comedy for me. Yes, you have the vampire. Yes, you have the werewolf. Yes, you have Frankenstein's monster. And then on the other side, yes, you had like, this weird family that does weird things, but in the end they're a loving family. So both shows were more comedy than horror.
I definitely agree with that. I wouldn't really consider it horror, even as close, not even close to the blurred line. It was campy.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
was good, definitely wholesome, but I wouldn't really consider it horror. Even the Rob Zombie one, it wasn't really
Did you
horror.
actually watch that?
I did.
I suffered through. I suffered through it. It was
So despite the fact that it has a lot of horror elements, so being all the supernatural things, the torture, the all this stuff, you still won't consider it horror because it was campy, because it was wholesome.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it was more of a family get together show. It didn't elicit that whole feeling of fear or terror or anything like that. It was made to be, for me, it was made to be comedy. Yeah,
yeah,
the torture scenes were comedic because, they enjoy it. They enjoyed putting themselves in different situations and doing strange things and kooky things and stuff like that. So it is not horror. Just
So
because it has the whole elements of horror, like the monsters and poison and torture and stuff like that, it's not horror.
I'm actually going to disagree with both of you, and I'm going to say it is horror. I will count it as more of like a gateway drug to horror, but I do think it is horror. And it is because when they came out, they did break the mold and they did horrify people. And it did cause people to have that fear and gasp and disgust because it was things that you shouldn't watch on television. And so there is that, like, for the time of when it came out, there was that aspect of horror for their audiences. I mean, if you think and you go and you look back at some of the early seasons of Supernatural, it was a little on the campy side if you really look at it. When you think about it, it's kind of wholesome because it's two brothers fighting against the odds to be together. So, who's to say in like another 20 years somebody's not going to go look back at that the way that you do, Karen, at the Munsters and the early Addams Family and go, that's not horror. That's just some, wholesome comedy, like whatever. Yeah, it's got some horror elements, but it's not really horror. So even though by today's standards, it probably wouldn't be considered it, I think they would have been, especially for the time that they came out.
I mean,
But I definitely think they're like a gateway to horror. It's like a nice like lead in to be like, well, I want to see more stuff with vampires in it because I thought that was kind of cool. Or oh, like they're talking about these like weird like, supernatural like beings as cousins. Let me go like read up on that. And I feel like it's just like this like trickle effect and it brings you into the genre with a big warm hug.
I mean, yeah, it's
I can
considered like I would see that would be considered a gateway into horror. But the thing is, and it shouldn't have been shown on TV. But it also reminds me of the time when couples were in separate beds
Mhm.
yeah,
in sitcoms, and then when they finally put the beds together, it was a whole crap show.
Mhm.
Just like how
yeah.
the monsters and the Adams were. So that was kind of more they were getting the effect for the times. Because how are you going to have a baby when you're sleeping in two beds?
Who said you had to do things in separate beds later on? You just slept in separate beds. You could do things anywhere else you pleased.
That's horrific to think about.
The visions in my head were just wrong.
You're welcome, guys. You're welcome.
Because now it makes me think like, did my parents do it on that table? Hmm.
Hey,
We eat off that table. Hmm.
that's a topic for a
Reminds
different
me,
kind of podcast. But, I do think those shows did startle and shock the audiences. And so yeah, even though it was campy and even though it was wholesome, I think there was still a shock value to it, and that's kind of like the thing about horror is that it causes reactions from us. So during that time, that's what it did. I mean,
Okay, I'll give you that.
I'll give you
I'll
that.
give you that.
if you just think of just the evolution of horror as a whole, like, do you think of, the Universal's Dracula as a scary film? Does it bring, disgust and horror and all that? Or do you find it to be kind of campy and kind of funny, but yet you still call it horror? So it's like, where's the line? And I feel like the line constantly moves.
It always moves. I mean, it's like life.
Hmm.
The finish line always moves.
Yes, yes, it does. Yes, it does. So with that being said, let's go ahead and just kind of give our final thoughts. What is horror? Lisa, you want to go first?
Sure. Horror is what elicits fear and foreboding and gives you a feeling of dread, but it helps you, I don't know, it brings you into the story so that you feel like you can't get away. And it terrifies you and unnerves you all at the same time, but you still keep watching.
Okay, Karen.
For me, horror is horror. As long as it provides that emotions that you're looking for in the storytelling, and it also in a way it can be thought provoking. Because you have those questions of what if I could be that villain? What if I could be that final girl or the hero? What if this could actually happen in real life? It's that whole thought process and thought provokingness of it. Thought provokingness, that's not even a word. It's that whole aspect of, what ifs.
Okay. To me, horror is its beauty and the most terrifying things. I think it is something that moves us to feel. It moves us to think. It moves our bodies to react in a certain way. And for some of us, it triggers our flight or fight response. Does our heart rate, go up? Does our blood pressure rise? Does it make us fidget in our seats while we're watching it or even reading it? And then for some of us, I feel like it tickles the inner portions of our minds where it makes us laugh because we can see how ridiculous something is. But it helps us, I think, be more appreciative of the world around us and to see the beauty even in the dark aspects of it. Like with the Addams family, I think it gave us all a very healthy look at death and the macabre, and understanding that just because it's dark and spooky and scary doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, which I think is true. I think with horror, it shows us some of the most horrific things, but it shows us some of the most beautiful things all at the same time. And so horror is something that is absolutely brilliant and I think should be sprinkled in almost every other genre. And that's why I kind of like that there are blurred lines, and I like how it is based off of perspective on what truly horrifies you and really elicits those emotions.
And also it's kind of a release, in a way.
Yeah.
You get to release all those feelings,
Mhm.
and in a way it also calms you because once you have that pent up emotion, once you get to release it, you're almost in a state of calm.
It's cathartic.
Yeah.
To me, horror is kind of like a roller coaster, and I love roller coasters. You have the thrill of like all the twists and turns, and that split second moment where you feel yourself rising up out of your seat, and you're like, please let this harness hold. And then you have that drop, and you're just like, ah, please stay on the track. And then by the time you're done, you've got this high that is a million miles high out of the stratosphere, and you feel alive. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Right.
That's horror.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is horror.
Mhm.
Yes, it is.
Wow, that was kind of fun. All right. So, all of you who are listening, do you guys agree with us? What is your opinion? Please let us know. Hit us up on all of our socials because we would love to hear your haunting thoughts on what horror is to you. And we would love to continue this conversation. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, X, Threads, and our Facebook group. You can also subscribe and rate us wherever you listen to podcasts, such as like Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, and we will be on YouTube. So you guys can all also follow us on our own personal social medias. So where can they find you, Lisa?
They can find me on Instagram and Facebook and Threads. I just added that.
Rock on. Karen?
Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, formerly known as Twitter, and the Tiki Talkie.
Rock on, rock on. And you guys can find me on basically all the social medias under Spilled Tea Wine Media Mind. I have a link tree, so if you go to one, you can go to all of them.
Oh yeah.
But before we go, we want to actually really thank you guys, the listeners, for joining us. We really appreciate you and your support. We also want to thank the ESO Network for being the reason that we're here today. So stay spooky, our lovely ghouls. Toodles.